Just a couple of months ago, the Golden State Warriors were celebrating a pretty unexpected run to an NBA title, a team that came out of the KD era, dealt with some injury issues, added some younger guys, and really put it all together to win yet another title within what many call, including myself, a true dynasty. You can argue that elsewhere if you'd like. But now, things aren't going particularly well for Golden State, and despite the fact that Steph is having an unbelievable season, they're a little bit of a disaster right now. Now, when it comes to the Warriors, the question right now is, did they make a mistake? And did they make a couple of mistakes? Even though, yes, they won the title last year, the conversation for 2.5 years around Golden State has been, should they make some kind of move? Do they need another star? Do they need another wing? Do they need to add pieces to this roster in an era in which, like, they're coming out of a situation where they brought in KD, that certainly shook up the roster a ton, then they brought in D'Angelo Russell, then they brought in Andrew Wiggins. There was a lot of moving pieces in Golden State, and over the last few seasons, they've had an opportunity, they've had the assets to make more moves like that, and they chose not to. Ultimately, obviously, they won the title last year, so certainly that wasn't a mistake, but now when you look at the roster this year, and specifically the contributions of the younger players, and how some of their former core pieces are getting older and aren't as effective, the question is, should they have done a better job of putting together a team around Steph, who is still playing incredibly well, rather than continually relying on pieces that they've had in the past? And those pieces, of course, are primarily Klay Thompson and Draymond Green. Now, Klay Thompson has had an awful offensive start to the season, which is weird because he really turned it on at the end of the finals last year. He had an up and down playoffs, but just like Draymond, the last couple of games of the finals last year, those guys looked like vintage Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, and they were shooting the ball well, at least Klay was. They were both guarding well, and Klay has just not been the same this year, and there's really no explanation for it, like I said, because if he hadn't been good at all last year, you just say, oh, well, he's still trying to come back from the injury stuff, like it makes sense, but he had moments last year where he was really good, and the consistency, the shot making, the efficiency, the defense has just not been there for Klay. And then Draymond is someone that we've seen decline offensively over the last couple of seasons, but still has brought it defensively, and he's still been good this year defensively, not as good as he has been in the past. And without those two guys playing at the levels they expected them to and the levels they played at the end of the finals last year, there's actually not a ton on this team the more and more you look. I mean, you've got Steph, who's playing unbelievably. Jordan Poole signed this big contract extension and has been incredibly inconsistent on a night-to-night basis, and still, I would argue, is largely unproven as a night-to-night player and a $35 million a year guy. And then the rest of the roster is some young guys and some guys they could have moved and some interesting high upside pieces and some veterans and some role players. But actually, in terms of depth and other star power, there's a shockingly little amount of those two things, considering this is a team that, for the most part, as currently constructed, won a title a couple of months ago. Now, obviously, there were some departures in the offseason. Gary Payton is no longer there. Otto Porter is no longer there. There have been some changes to this roster, bringing in guys like Dante DiVincenzo and JaMychal Green, but the core pieces are still there. All those young guys, headlined by Jordan Poole, Jonathan Kuminga, James Wiseman, who didn't play a role last year. All the veterans, Klay, Steph, Draymond, Kevon Looney, those guys are all still there, and it's interesting how much they've been struggling. And the argument, again, the conversation is like, should they have made one of these moves over the last couple of seasons? Should they have traded one of these picks that became, Jonathan Kuminga? Should they have traded Kuminga and Moody and Wiseman and whatever the case may be? I think that's an interesting conversation. But when you talk about mistakes, one mistake they absolutely made, unfortunately at this point, was the James Wiseman selection. This was the get out of jail free card for Golden State post KD. So like, they have this awful season and everybody gets hurt the year after KD leaves, and they get the second pick in the draft. Like, there's videos, I made some myself, you can go out there and look about how unfair it is that Golden State just basically tanked a season away because of injuries and became a team that was going to get a top 3 pick in the draft to add already to a nucleus that looks really, really good, either as a trade asset or otherwise. And unfortunately for them, I say they made a mistake, and they did, because, it could have taken LaMelo or Patrick Williams, I guess. There's some other options. It's not a very interesting top 10. But overall, the biggest issue is that draft that they happened to get the second overall pick in, where they could have gotten their like Tim Duncan level player to extend this era. That draft just wasn't particularly good. Anthony Edwards has been unbelievable for Minnesota. I still really like LaMelo. There really wasn't a selection here that made sense for them once it became clear Anthony Edwards was going to go first, and it became clear that they didn't want to bring in LaMelo to this guard nucleus that they already have or had at the time. And the Wiseman selection, I would argue, is the thing that has held them back the most in this last couple of seasons since they selected Wiseman, rather than the trade stuff they could have made, which we're going to talk about later in the video. And there's some interesting parallels to some other guys we've seen recently come into the league and have struggled similarly to Wiseman. Someone that comes to mind all the time when I watch Wiseman is Marvin Bagley, a guy that also at times struggled to stay on the floor in the beginning of his career, was also the second pick of the draft, also this big left-handed guy with a ton of skill that you felt like was going to develop into this really quality two-way big that had issues defensively, but obviously the offensive skill was there. The difference for Wiseman is, in comparison to Bagley, was that we didn't really have that much of a gauge on how good he was as a college player, because he only played a handful of college games before some eligibility issues caused him to, basically just train for the draft, get drafted second overall ultimately. And the failings for him are a couple. One, he can't stay on the floor. 2, offensively, that skill set is just not developed the way that Golden State would want it to. 3, the way that 5s play in Golden State, you have to be able to guard much better than James Wiseman has been able to. And 4, it's difficult to get a 5 that fits well within this system. It's one of the reasons they play Draymond so successfully at the 5 over the years, because it requires a lot of basketball IQ. It requires a lot of screening in different ways. It's not just stand at the top and set a ball screen. You're screening off the ball. You're switching the angle of your screen. You're really have to identify exactly where you need to be all the time and think of yourself almost solely as a screener and as in Draymond's case, like a pivot point offensively and something that everybody else rotates around. And that's just not something that James Wiseman, who at the time he was drafted to the Warriors, had played like 8 or 9 non-high school basketball games in his entire life leading into the NBA. He just never had the foundation to begin to learn all the intricacies that he would have needed to learn in Golden State. And if they had nailed that draft pick, we would not be having this conversation right now. They had the opportunity to bring in a big time player with the 2nd overall pick, and they chose poorly, and he didn't develop correctly. And maybe there's still some hope for him. I've pretty much completely given up on him. And it's actually kind of incredible that Golden State went through all that. They went through the injuries. They got the 2nd pick of the draft and got nothing from the 2nd pick in the draft and still ended up winning the title last year. Now, the larger conversation I think people are mostly going to focus on is, should Golden State have made some moves over the last couple of seasons to trade away, Kuminga, future draft picks, potentially Jordan Poole last year before they signed the big extension, of course, Wiseman. And to me, here's the problem. You can't argue, 1, with the fact that they won the title, and 2, with the fact that this is what Golden State does. Like they bring guys in and they develop them. Like prior to bringing in Kevin Durant, prior to bringing in D'Angelo Russell, prior to bringing in Andrew Wiggins, like they drafted their guys, they signed some free agents, and for the most part, they developed those. I mean, you can go back and look at trading away Monte Ellis in exchange for Andrew Bogut, things like that. But for the most part, like Golden State drafts, they develop, and they're not a huge trade team. They're not a team that's giving away all these future first round picks. They're not a team that's giving away all these young assets. And they felt like, hey, the thing that made us good in the first place, not only of course was incredible shooting and Steph and Klay and all those guys, leading into the 15-16 range, but also was all this incredible depth we had. Like we had Andre Iguodala, we had multiple guys that could handle the ball, we had multiple guys that can guard, could shoot, and they felt like they had that nucleus with Moody, with Kuminga, with Wiseman at the 5 spot, with Looney, with all these, with Jordan Poole. All these other guys are like, we're good. Like we have never been, like, apart from KD, a chasing stars kind of organization, and the KD thing was just too good of an opportunity to pass up. And so it's easy now to look at this team and think, oh well, this guy's not really contributing, Kuminga's not really playing, Moody's not really a big deal, like they should have moved these guys and they would have been much better off. It's easier to say that now, but that goes completely against the foundational principles that made this organization what they were going into that 14, 15, 16 range before they got Kevin Durant, and then post, honestly, Kevin Durant as well, developing guys like Andrew Wiggins, who, yes, they brought in via trade, but they only kind of just rolled over that Kevin Durant asset multiple times into Russell and then to Wiggins and the pick, and this is what they do. And so it's hard to look back and be like, they should have done this, this, and this, not only because they won the title, but because organizationally, this is the foundation of what they do. They are a draft and develop team and a smart front office team rather than a chips all-in team. Now, having said that, they cannot waste this year of Steph Curry. Because they're losing, I'm not sure enough people are paying attention to how unbelievable Steph has been this year. And the nice thing about Golden State is they don't have to worry about Steph, asking out or being unhappy. Like, he's going to be there. You can build around him. And if Klay and Draymond are not going to be these sidekicks that they once were for Steph, if they want to be championship contenders this season, they have to make some kind of move. And it's difficult because Looney's really integral to what they do. They can't really move him or his contract. Wiggins, same thing. Like, he is their wing defender. He's one of the better rebounders of the team, and a team that struggles with rebounding. Like, they need him. So it would have to be, Wiseman, who I'm not sure anybody sees any real value in right now, Moody, Kuminga, some future picks. Like, I don't know how far that's getting you. I don't know if there's really a true upgrade out there that makes sense for them, because what they need is a bigger guy that provides them some kind of offensive focal point's not the correct word, but that kind of brings some attention away from Steph at least a little bit, can space the floor. And it's a lot of boxes to try and check when you're not trading away like a foundational asset that another team would be really, really interested in. I think continually the Kevin Durant thing gets thrown around. I think that's really, really unlikely. Like maybe Zach LaVine, but that's not really like the bigger wing they need because they still struggle to rebound the ball. They need a 5 as well. They need depth at a lot of different places because their young guys are just not performing. And where I would land on this is they didn't necessarily make a mistake in the past, because you can't argue with the title. You can't argue with the foundational principles of this organization that led them to this era of success. But this season, they're going to need to alter those principles if they hope to be contenders. And this might be, you never know, like you can never take these things for granted. Like this might be the last great Steph year. And as a result, the last year you have a real chance to win the title. And for the most expensive roster in the league and in league history, you can't really afford to be like, maybe Steph will be really good next year. You have to make those kinds of moves. And maybe we should have seen this coming with the Jordan Poole Draymond thing before the season, or maybe they should have traded Draymond before the year. They've got a contract issue with him to deal with as well. And ultimately, it feels like a situation where there's going to have to be some kind of move. Someone's going to come available on one of these teams that is, maybe playing okay right now, but is going to tank ultimately. And you bring in someone at the 5 spot that can help you space and protect the rim. Maybe someone like Miles Turner, or it has to be something, right? Like whether it's Moody, whether it's Kuminga, whether it's Wiseman, whether it's future picks. I think the Draymond thing is unlikely in terms of a trade. I think a Klay trade is unlikely. It would have to be the younger guys, and adding a little bit more juice to the starting lineup and a little bit more depth on other places on the roster. There's a path still for them to get towards contention, and I don't necessarily think that those mistakes that some people are pointing out in the past now in hindsight prohibit them from being championship contenders this season. I just think they might need to alter their thinking a little bit here, because for a team that celebrated a title a couple of months ago, this is one of, if not the worst title defenses we've seen in the last decade in the NBA, at least so far.